Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. Story 1. The Unseen Hand. It started with the whispers, faint and indistinct, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. At first, I dismissed them as the creaks and groans of my old Victorian house, a relic from the 19th century nestled on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could no longer ignore them. I moved into the house 3 months ago, eager to escape the chaos of the city and find solace in the tranquility of the countryside. The house, with its ornate architecture and overgrown garden, seemed to call to me, promising a fresh start. Little did I know, it had other plans. My first night was uneventful. I unpacked my belongings, cooked a simple dinner, and settled into my new life. The next morning, I noticed small things out of place, a chair slightly askew, a book that had moved from the shelf to the table. I brushed it off as my imagination, perhaps the result of fatigue from the move. As days turned into weeks, the occurrences became more frequent. Shadows flitted at the edge of my vision, disappearing when I turned to look. Objects moved without explanation, and a chilling draft seemed to follow me from room to room. I began to feel as though I was being watched, a constant prickling at the back of my neck. One particularly cold night, as I lay in bed, the whispers returned. They were clearer now, a soft murmur that I could almost understand. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear, but the words eluded me. Then, just as I was drifting into sleep, I felt it, a gentle, almost loving stroke of fingers through my hair. I bolted upright, my breath catching in my throat. The room was dark and silent, the only sound the frantic beating of my heart. I fumbled for the lamp on my bedside table and switched it on, flooding the room with light. There was no one there. I was alone. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a dream, a trick of the mind. But the sensation was too real, too vivid to dismiss. I could still feel the lingering touch on my scalp, a cold shiver running down my spine. I slept with the light on that night, but it brought little comfort. Over the next few days, the whispers became more frequent and the touches more insistent. I could no longer ignore the presence in my home. Desperation drove me to the town library, where I delved into the history of the house. What I found was both fascinating and horrifying. The house had belonged to a family named the Eldreds, who had mysteriously vanished over a century ago. Rumors of hauntings and ghostly apparitions plagued the property, driving away previous owners. The townsfolk avoided the house, claiming it was cursed. They spoke of dark rituals and restless spirits, of a tragedy that had left its mark on the very walls. Armed with this knowledge, I returned home, determined to uncover the truth. As night fell, I prepared myself for another encounter, my mind racing with questions. Who, or what, was in my house? And what did it want from me? The whispers grew louder, filling the air with an eerie, unsettling melody. I felt a cold breath on my neck and turned slowly. In the dim light, a shadowy figure stood at the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised a hand, and I felt the familiar, chilling touch of fingers brushing through my hair. Hey, subscribe for more scary stories. Paralyzed with fear, I stared at the shadowy figure, my mind racing to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure's eyes seemed to pierce through me, filling me with a cold dread that seeped into my bones. I wanted to move, to scream, but my body refused to obey. The figure's hand continued to stroke my hair, an unnervingly gentle touch that belied its terrifying presence. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the figure was trying to communicate. I strained to make sense of the words, but they remained just beyond my grasp. Suddenly, the figure stepped back, its form dissipating into the shadows. The room plunged into silence, leaving me gasping for breath. The next morning, I resolved to learn more about the Eldred family. I needed to understand who, or what, was haunting me and why. I visited the town's oldest resident, Mrs. Hawthorne, hoping she could shed some light on the house's dark history. Her eyes widened when I mentioned the Eldreds, and she invited me in, her demeanor shifting from curiosity to concern. The Eldred family was well known in these parts, Mrs. Hawthorne began, her voice low and grave. They were wealthy, but they had their secrets. Rumors of strange rituals and dark magic surrounded them. One night, they vanished without a trace. Some say they were taken by the spirits they tried to control. I listened, enthralled and horrified, as Mrs. Hawthorne recounted the tale. The family consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Eldred and their 2 children, Evelyn and Thomas. According to legend, Evelyn had a special gift, the ability to communicate with the dead. The family had moved to the house to harness this power, performing rituals to contact the spirit world. But something went terribly wrong. Some believe Evelyn's powers unleashed something dark, Mrs. Hawthorne continued, her eyes clouded with memories. The night they disappeared, neighbors heard screams and saw strange lights. The next morning, the house was empty, and the family was never seen again. Many think their spirits are still trapped there, seeking release. Armed with this new information, I returned home, determined to free the spirits and put an end to the haunting. I spent hours researching rituals and protective spells, hoping to find a way to communicate with the entities. As night fell, I prepared myself for another encounter, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. I lit candles around the room, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. Clutching a book of ancient incantations, I began to recite a ritual to summon the spirits. The air grew cold, and the whispers returned, louder and more coherent. I could hear distinct voices now, pleading, desperate, and full of sorrow. Suddenly, the figure reappeared, but this time it wasn't alone. 2 smaller figures stood beside it, their eyes glowing with the same eerie light. "Help us," a soft, child's voice whispered, sending chills down my spine. It was Evelyn. She reached out to me, her ghostly form flickering in the candlelight. "We are trapped." I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. "How can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling. Evelyn's eyes filled with a profound sadness as she began to speak. She told me of the dark ritual that had gone wrong, how they had accidentally bound their souls to the house. "We need you to finish the ritual," Evelyn said, her voice a haunting echo. "Release us, and we will leave you in peace." The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to press in on me, but I nodded, determined to end this nightmare. I followed Evelyn's instructions, chanting the incantations she provided. The air crackled with energy, and the shadows writhed as if in pain. The figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the darkness. Just as I thought it was over, a chilling voice cut through the air. "You cannot free them," it hissed. "They are mine." The voice sent a jolt of terror through me, freezing me in place. The air grew thick with an oppressive presence, and the temperature plummeted. The candles flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent glee. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything. "Evelyn?" I called out, my voice trembling. The child's ghostly form reappeared, but now she seemed afraid, her eyes wide with terror. "He is the one who trapped us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He won't let us go." "Who is he?" I demanded, but Evelyn's form began to waver, her image growing faint. Before she could answer, the dark entity materialized in front of me. It was a tall, shadowy figure, its form constantly shifting and undulating as if made of smoke. Its eyes glowed with an intense, malevolent light. The room seemed to pulse with its presence, a tangible wave of dread washing over me. "You have no power here," the entity growled, its voice a guttural rasp. "Leave, or suffer the consequences." My heart pounded in my chest, but I stood my ground. "I won't leave until I free them," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "What do you want?" The entity's eyes narrowed, and a sinister smile spread across its face. "You cannot free them," it hissed. "They belong to me, and soon, so will you." I felt a cold, invisible hand wrap around my throat, cutting off my air. I gasped, clawing at the unseen force, but it was no use. The entity's grip tightened, and black spots danced in my vision. Just as I thought I would pass out, the pressure suddenly released, and I collapsed to the floor, coughing and wheezing. "Leave this place," the entity commanded, its voice echoing in my ears. "Or face my wrath." Desperate for answers, I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the book of incantations. Flipping through the pages, I searched for something, anything that could help. My eyes landed on a spell of banishment, a complex ritual designed to expel malevolent spirits. It was risky, and I had no guarantee it would work, but it was my only hope. I began to chant the words, my voice shaky but growing stronger with each verse. The air crackled with energy, and the entity let out a furious roar. "You dare defy me," it bellowed, but I continued the incantation, my determination unwavering. The shadows around me seemed to writhe and convulse, the entity's form flickering as it fought against the spell. I could feel its anger, a searing heat that threatened to overwhelm me, but I pressed on. The room vibrated with an otherworldly force, the walls themselves seeming to warp and twist under the strain. "Release them," I shouted, pouring all my strength into the final words of the spell. The entity let out a deafening scream, a sound of pure rage and agony. Its form shattered into 1,000 pieces, dissolving into the darkness. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting from my shoulders. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but victorious. As I lay there, catching my breath, I saw Evelyn and her family standing before me, their forms shimmering with a soft, ethereal light. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "You have freed us." I smiled weakly, relief washing over me. "You're welcome," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Rest in peace." As the spirits began to fade, a sudden realization hit me. The house was still. Too still. The silence was unnatural, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. A cold dread settled over me as I sensed another presence, something even darker lurking in the shadows. Just as I began to rise, the whispering returned, louder and more menacing than before. The air grew cold once more, and I felt a familiar touch, cold fingers stroking my hair. My heart sank as I realized the dark entity was not gone. It had merely been waiting. The touch of those cold fingers sent a wave of dread through me. I realized that the entity was still there, lurking, watching. The room, once filled with an oppressive presence, now felt even more sinister, as if the entity had absorbed the darkness left by the spirits I had freed. I had to finish this, to banish the entity for good. My life depended on it. Gathering my courage, I stood up, the weight of exhaustion pulling at me. The entity's whispers grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the room like a chilling chant. "You cannot escape," it hissed. "You belong to me now." Ignoring its taunts, I grabbed the book of incantations, desperately searching for something stronger, more definitive. My fingers trembled as I flipped through the pages, the whispers growing louder, more chaotic. I found a spell of ultimate banishment, a last resort. It required a great sacrifice, but it was the only way. With trembling hands, I began the incantation. The air around me thickened, crackling with dark energy. The entity's form coalesced in front of me, its eyes blazing with fury. "You dare challenge me again?" it roared, its voice a cacophony of anger and hatred. I continued the chant, my voice steady despite the fear gripping my heart. The shadows around the entity began to writhe, reacting to the power of the spell. "Leave this place," I commanded, my voice rising above the din. "Return to the darkness from whence you came." The entity's form flickered, its eyes narrowing with malice. It lunged at me, its shadowy tendrils reaching out to ensnare me. I felt a sharp, icy pain as they wrapped around my body, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. My life depended on finishing the spell. The room shook, the walls groaning under the strain of the ritual. The entity let out a scream, a sound so inhuman it pierced my very soul. The shadows around it began to dissolve, its form growing weaker, more transparent. I pushed through the pain, chanting the final words of the incantation with all the strength I could muster. A blinding light filled the room, and the entity let out one final, ear-splitting scream. Its form shattered, the shadows dissipating into the ether. The air cleared, and an eerie silence settled over the house. I collapsed to the floor, the exhaustion overwhelming me. For a moment, I lay there, listening to the quiet. The oppressive presence was gone, the whispers silenced. I had done it. I had banished the dark entity. But as relief washed over me, a new fear took hold. The final words of the spell echoed in my mind, a great sacrifice. I looked around, expecting something terrible to happen, but the house remained still. Then I felt it, a searing pain in my chest. I gasped, clutching at my heart as it felt like it was being ripped apart. The sacrifice. It was my life. The entity had taken its due. Darkness closed in around me as I lay on the cold floor. My vision blurred, the edges of the room fading away. The pain intensified, a fiery agony that consumed me. I realized with a sickening dread that I had traded my life to save the spirits and banish the entity. As the world dimmed, I heard a familiar whisper. "Thank you," Evelyn's voice echoed softly. "We are free because of you." Her words brought a small measure of peace, even as the darkness swallowed me whole. In my final moments, I felt a strange calm. I had faced the darkness and won, even if it cost me everything. The house was finally at peace. And as my consciousness faded, I knew that my sacrifice had not been in vain. The last thing I saw was a faint, ethereal light, like the dawn breaking through the night. Then, everything went black. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Haunting Frame. It was an ordinary day when I decided to hike up to the old woods behind my childhood home. The forest, dense and ancient, held a certain charm that always drew me in. I packed my camera, hoping to capture the serene beauty of nature. Little did I know that one photograph would change everything. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of leaves above. The air was cool and damp, the ground soft under my boots. I felt an odd sense of peace, mixed with an unsettling silence that seemed to swallow every step I took. Finally, I reached a clearing where the trees parted to reveal a stunning view of the valley below. I raised my camera and clicked. Reviewing the photos later that night, I felt a chill run down my spine. There, in the corner of one of the pictures, was a figure standing behind me. It was faint, almost ethereal, and definitely not there when I took the shot. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a tree. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I showed the photo to my best friend, Mark, the next day. "Do you see this?" I asked, pointing at the ghostly figure. His face paled as he examined the picture. "That's really creepy," he said, his voice shaky. "Are you sure you were alone?" "I swear I was," I replied, my heart pounding. There was no one else there. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air in my room felt heavy, oppressive. Shadows danced on the walls, twisted into shapes that seemed to mock me. Sleep was elusive, my mind racing with thoughts of the figure in the photograph. Who was it? What did it want? The next morning, I decided to go back to the clearing. I needed answers. Mark, reluctantly, agreed to join me. We retraced my steps, the forest seeming more sinister in the daylight. As we approached the clearing, I felt a cold breeze brush against my skin, despite the warm summer sun. There, in the same spot, I took another photo. This time, the figure was clearer, more defined. It was a woman, her face pale and eyes hollow. She was dressed in tattered clothes, her expression one of sorrow and longing. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, looking over my shoulder. "We need to get out of here." But I couldn't leave. "Not yet." "Wait," I said, my voice trembling. "I need to understand who she is." We spent hours in the clearing, searching for clues. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ground, we found it, a small, weathered gravestone, hidden beneath a tangle of roots and moss. The name on the stone was barely legible, but the date was clear, 1876. A chill ran through me as I realized we had disturbed something ancient, something restless. The figure in the photograph was more than just a ghost. She was a memory, a lingering fragment of a past long forgotten. And now, she had made herself known to us. The days that followed our discovery were filled with unease. My nights were restless, plagued by dreams of the ghostly figure. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw her hollow eyes staring back at me, her lips moving silently, as if trying to communicate something important. Mark tried to reassure me, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. We decided to visit the local library, hoping to unearth some information about the woman whose grave we had found. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, was eager to help. "Many families have lived in this area for generations," she said, leading us to the archives. "You might find what you're looking for in the old records." We spent hours poring over dusty ledgers and faded photographs. Finally, we found her, Eleanor Worthington, born in 1845, died in 1876. The brief note next to her name read, "Tragic end." I felt a shiver run down my spine. What had happened to her? Why was she haunting the woods? "Look at this," Mark said, pointing to an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Young woman disappears under mysterious circumstances." The article described how Eleanor had vanished one night, only to be found dead in the woods days later. No one knew what had happened to her, and her death remained a mystery. As we left the library, I couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was reaching out to us for a reason. "We need to go back," I said to Mark. "There has to be more to this." Reluctantly, he agreed. We returned to the clearing, the air thick with tension. The gravestones seemed even more weathered, as if eroding with each passing day. I took another photo, hoping to capture something that might give us a clue. This time, Eleanor's figure was clearer than ever, her hand outstretched, pointing towards the trees. We followed the direction she indicated, pushing through the dense underbrush. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin, hidden from view by the forest. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt alive. As we stepped inside, the air grew colder. Dust covered every surface, and the floorboards creaked under our weight. In the center of the room was an old, ornate mirror, its surface tarnished and cracked. I felt an inexplicable urge to look into it. The moment my reflection came into view, I saw her standing behind me, clearer than ever. Her lips moved, and this time, I could hear her faint whisper, "Help me." Mark and I exchanged a glance, both of us understanding the gravity of the situation. We were not just dealing with a ghost, we were dealing with a soul trapped in torment. "What do you want?" I asked aloud, my voice trembling. The cabin seemed to respond, the air growing colder, more oppressive. The mirror fogged up, and letters began to appear as if written by an invisible hand, "Find him." "Find who?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. But the answer was clear. Someone had wronged Eleanor, and her spirit would not rest until justice was served. Our discovery in the cabin left us with more questions than answers. The foggy message in the mirror haunted my thoughts. Who was him, and how could we find him after all these years? Eleanor's spirit was restless, and we were the ones she had chosen to set things right. Back at the library, we delved deeper into the town's history. We found more about Eleanor. She had been engaged to a man named Charles Prescott, a wealthy landowner known for his temper. There were whispers and rumors that their relationship had been tumultuous, marked by jealousy and control. Charles had disappeared shortly after Eleanor's death, leaving no trace. "It has to be him," Mark said, pointing at an old photograph of Charles. His stern face and piercing eyes sent chills down my spine. But how do we find someone who's been missing for over a century? I didn't have an answer, but I knew we had to try. The next step was to find any remaining descendants of Charles Prescott. Our search led us to a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. The current resident, an elderly man named Henry Prescott, was Charles's great-grandson. He greeted us with suspicion but agreed to talk when we explained our purpose. "My great-grandfather was a troubled man," Henry admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of old secrets. "There were always whispers about what happened to Eleanor, but no one ever had proof. Some say he was involved in dark rituals, trying to gain power at any cost. My heart raced. Do you have anything of his? Something that might help us understand what happened. Henry hesitated before leading us to an old chest in the attic. Inside were faded letters, a tarnished locket, and an old journal. The journal's pages were filled with cryptic notes about rituals and summoning spirits. One entry, dated just days before Eleanor's death, caught my eye. The ritual must be completed. Her soul will grant me power beyond imagination. We read on, horrified. Charles had indeed performed a dark ritual, sacrificing Eleanor to bind her spirit for his own gain. But something had gone wrong, and her spirit remained trapped, haunting the woods and the cabin. As we closed the journal, the temperature in the attic plummeted. I turned to see Eleanor's ghostly figure standing in the corner, her eyes filled with sorrow. She mouthed one word, destroy. We have to end this, I said, my voice firm. We need to destroy whatever he used to trap her. We gathered everything related to the ritual, Charles's journal, the locket, and some ritualistic tools, and made our way back to the cabin. The air was thick with tension, and the forest seemed to hold its breath as we approached. Inside the cabin, we placed the items in a circle and set them alight. The fire roared to life, and I felt a strange pull, as if something was being drawn out of the air. Eleanor's figure appeared once more, her face peaceful for the first time. Thank you, she whispered, her voice echoing in the silence. But as the flames consumed the last remnants of the ritual, the ground began to tremble. The cabin shook, and an otherworldly scream filled the air. Mark and I stumbled outside, watching in horror as the cabin collapsed in on itself, swallowed by the earth. We stood in silence, the forest eerily calm. Is it over? Mark asked, his voice barely audible. I hoped it was, but deep down, I feared we had only uncovered the surface of a much darker secret. Eleanor's spirit might be free, but something else had been awakened. The weeks following the cabin's collapse were eerily quiet. The forest seemed calmer, almost serene, and for a while, I believed that Eleanor's spirit had found peace. But the strange occurrences that began to plague my home soon shattered that illusion. It started with the mirror. One night, as I prepared for bed, I caught a glimpse of something moving behind me. Spinning around, I saw nothing out of place. But when I turned back to the mirror, there was a shadow, a dark figure lingering just out of focus. The same chilling presence I'd felt in the woods. The next few nights brought more disturbances, footsteps echoing through the house, doors creaking open on their own, and a cold breeze that seemed to follow me everywhere. Mark noticed the changes too. It's like something's following you, he said one evening, worry etched on his face. We need to figure out what's going on. We returned to Henry Prescott, hoping he might have more answers. When we told him about the disturbances, his face grew pale. I feared this might happen, he said, his voice trembling. The ritual your ancestor performed was powerful. By destroying the items, you might have released Eleanor, but something else was bound to them as well. What do you mean? I asked, a knot of dread forming in my stomach. Henry explained that Charles had tried to summon a powerful entity, something dark and ancient. The ritual went wrong, trapping Eleanor's spirit but also binding this entity to the land. By destroying the ritual items, we had released it. You need to contain it, Henry urged, before it gains strength. Desperation led us back to the woods. Armed with knowledge from Charles's journal, we gathered supplies for a new ritual, one to banish the entity. The clearing felt different now, as if the very air pulsed with malevolence. We set up the ritual circle, following the instructions meticulously. As night fell, the atmosphere grew oppressive, and the shadows seemed to close in around us. We began the ritual, chanting the incantations from the journal. The air grew colder, and the ground trembled. Suddenly, the figure from the photograph appeared, no longer just a shadow but a terrifying, tangible presence. Its form was grotesque, shifting and writhing as if made of smoke and darkness. You cannot stop me, it hissed, its voice a chorus of whispers. I am eternal. Fear threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to continue. We have to finish the ritual. I shouted to Mark, who nodded, his face set in determination. Together, we chanted the final lines, the words burning with power. The entity screamed, a sound that echoed through the forest, rattling my very bones. The air around us shimmered, and the ground split open, drawing the entity towards it. With a final, deafening roar, it was sucked into the earth, the rift sealing shut behind it. Silence fell, the oppressive weight lifting. The forest was still, the night air crisp and clear. We collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. "Is it over?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse. "I think so," I replied, though doubt lingered in my mind. The entity was gone, banished, but the scars it left behind were deep. Eleanor's spirit was free, but the darkness that had haunted the woods for so long had taken its toll. As we made our way back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that our victory was temporary. The photograph, the shadows, and the eerie occurrences had marked us. The forest held many secrets, and we had only scratched the surface. But for now, we had peace, and that was enough. Years later, I would still find myself drawn to that old photograph, a reminder of the darkness we had faced and the mysteries that lay hidden in the quiet corners of our world. The forest had returned to its serene beauty, but I knew, deep down, that it would never truly be the same. And neither would I. The end. Subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.